What's up, everybody? Today we are talking about fragrances. The channel, I of course am Luke. This is Bond's apartment. Today we are going to talk about fragrances and the fact that James Bond 007 throughout the novels and the films never really wears any sort of fragrance. So which begs the question, which would he wear? Now I can't do this alone. No, sir. So I need to bring in some sort of fragrance expert, and believe it or not, in the Bond community, we actually have one. You may recognize him. It's Ryan from Analyze This, Mr. Bond. What's up, Ryan?
Hello, I'm Ryan from Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of 007 and dig into what lies beneath the surface. But James Bond is only one of my obsessions. I am also an avid collector of fragrances and have been for roughly a decade now, so I've been an active participant in the online fragrance community, or the FragCom as we call it, and have owned many, many fragrances over the years. I've tended to trade and swap over the years, so my collection has been a sort of fluid collection, but I've owned quite a few fragrances. So it's wonderful to be here to discuss the intersection between two of my obsessions, James Bond and the world of fragrance and perfume. So as you can see here, I've pulled out some pieces from my collection, and I am looking forward to how this conversation is going to go.
Thank you for that, Ryan. We'll check back in with you in just a second. And yes, the official 007 cologne just happened to appear as we cut to Ryan. We'll just leave that off to the side for the duration of the video. What we're going to do, we'll talk a little bit about the history of Bond, Fleming, and cologne, or perfume, or fragrance. We will talk about notes, oil-based versus alcohol-based, and then dupes, something like this. We'll periodically check in with Ryan throughout the video to just kind of further nail home these points we're trying to make. So let's get started. So to start with the history really is as simple as the brand Floris. Now, Floris number 89 was Ian Fleming's personal favorite fragrance. That's a very citrusy, woody fragrance. It's orange, bergamot, lavender, neroli, orris. Those are the scents that make up this particular cologne. Now, when it comes to Bond, it's only mentioned in the novels, and it's mentioned 3 times. Thank you for James Bond Lifestyle, Remmert, for having this very easily accessible, this information. Quote number 1 is from Moonraker. Floris provides the soaps and lotions in the lavatories and bedrooms. Quote number 2 is from Diamonds Are Forever. He would have to send a cable to May to get things fixed. Let's see. Flowers, bath essence from Floris, air the sheets. And lastly, from Dr. No, there was everything in the bathroom. Floris lime bath essence for men, your Lane bath cubes for women. So the 2 scents that I have here personally are Floris number 007 and then Floris 7172, which is a collaboration with Turnbull and Asser. Now, Turnbull and Asser has been outfitting Bond since Dr. No, since Sean Connery, all the way up until Casino Royale. So not only does Floris have a collaboration with yet another Bond brand, but Turnbull and Asser is a very, very historically rich Bond brand when it comes to that relationship with the films. They continue to create heritage pieces or recreate pieces from Dr. No all the way up till Casino Royale. And then of course Floris went ahead and collaborated with Bond itself and made this 007 scent. The 007 has star notes of amber, bergamot, and rose. And the 7172 has star notes of lavender, mandarin, and sandalwood. So with the lavender and the mandarin, it's closer to the number 89 that you would actually see Ian Fleming wearing, which is kind of what most likely started this whole collaboration with Floris and 007. We know that Fleming like to include personal life experiences into this character. For more on the history of Bond and Floris, let's send it back over to Ryan.
So when we talk about the history of fragrance in the world of James Bond, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to Ian Fleming, because Ian Fleming really established this association between Bond and fragrance. Not directly. Ian Fleming's James Bond does not wear a cologne. He doesn't wear a fragrance. But he's very interested in fragrance grooming products. He's very interested in scented bath products. There are a lot of specific references to those in the novels. Among them, a few of the houses I've collected here. So we have Floris, which is a very traditional, upstanding British perfumery house. We have Trumper, another upstanding British perfumery house, and we have some Guerlains that also get mentioned. Guerlain is also important to Bond by virtue of being the perfume Tracy is said to be wearing in the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service. She's wearing Le Bleu by Guerlain, a classic feminine fragrance of the time. And so these houses start to become part of the Bond brand legacy by virtue of Ian Fleming. At the same time, you also have Sean Connery and Roger Moore wearing the same fragrance. They wore the same fragrance. It was a Guerlain. It was Guerlain Jicky. So Jicky is one of the very first formative representations of the genre we call a fougere. A fougere is a perfume that is said to evoke a fern. Fougere is French for fern, but ferns don't really have a smell, so it's more of an abstract green fragrance, primarily built around lavender. If you have prominent lavender, odds are it sort of falls into the fougere category. It's usually lavender braced with musk, a bit of vanilla or tonka in the base to sweeten things up, some spices perhaps. I do not have Jicky in my collection, but I do have the current edition of the very first fougere ever produced, which is Fougere Royale. That's this bottle here. And this is the genre that defined masculine perfumery in the 20th century. It was not originally a masculine style per se. Fragrance was much more of a unisex phenomenon up until the 20th century, and it's really as marketing starts to take root in the 20th century that you see this bifurcation between masculine and feminine perfumery styles, especially in the West. For example, just to share a related anecdote, Old Spice was originally marketed to women. It was only when they started to observe that men were drawn to the scent profile more that it became the masculine classic that we recognize today, you know, the everyman's fragrance. And it was similarly the case with the fougere. The fougere was introduced in its early form. Jicky and Fougere Royale are kind of the two classics of the genre, but it ended up evolving over time. If you're not familiar with the fougere, you may be familiar with the great drugstore fougere Brut, which is worn by men over the course of the 20th century, is a big classic. You can even get some today, though it's kind of a shadow of its former self in the current form. And that sort of style also fits in with the styles of fragrances that we see from Floris and Trumper. There are two particular fragrances that have Bond associations that are fougeres beyond Jicky, which Jicky was Roger Moore and Sean Connery's fragrance, but we also have the mentioned fragrance Euchris, which is by Trumper, and Euchris is a sort of dark gothic fougere in its current form, so if you try that, you would recognize that. Also, Floris number 89, the scent of Ian Fleming, that is also an entrant into the fougere category. Now, the fougere was very popular up until the mid-20th century, into the 70s and 80s in particular, where it got very gruff, very loud, very bold. After that point, fragrance starts to shift in profile, and with the introduction of certain synthetic molecules that produce aromas that we call aquatics. They're kind of like watery, abstract sea-like notes, kind of watery, fresh notes. In the 1990s, this takes off in a big way. And actually what you see Pierce Brosnan wearing by the time he's doing the Bond films is Creed's Millésime Impériale, which is a salty, fruity fragrance, much fresher than the sort of richness of the Fougère style with its kind of herbal lavender, its spiky greenness. He's wearing that sort of fresh, sort of elegant, slightly seashore style fragrance. And Daniel Craig, when he did Casino Royale, he also looked to Creed, and he was wearing Virgin Island water, which is another tropical scent. So there was this sense in the late 90s and early 2000s of this fresh, slightly tropical vibe being in play in masculine perfumery. Of course, by the time Quantum of Solace came around, Tom Ford was a big influence on Daniel Craig's style, and Daniel Craig was wearing Tobacco Vanille, which I understand you are a fan of as well, Luke, and it was a big fragrance for me. Tobacco Vanille was, in many ways, what inspired me to get into fragrance to begin with. I wasn't aware that fragrances could be as interesting or rich as Tobacco Vanille. Now, Tobacco Vanille was carrying again from trends that had started in the 90s. The 90s introduced in a big way the category of this sweeter fragrance, the gourmand fragrance, that has sort of like a dessert level sweetness to it. And Tobacco Vanille was, at the time of its release, a really singular and bold take on that profile. So in a way, you see the entire history of masculine perfumery play out in the association we see with James Bond.
Up next, with the amount of Tom Ford that we've seen in the Daniel Craig era, everything post Casino Royale was pretty much Tom Ford. Most of his suits, a lot of the clothes he wore outside of suits, and then the main reason I've included, so I've actually got, this is my wife's, along with this candle that's never been lit, because it smells incredible. The main reason I've included Tom Ford is because it's been said that Daniel Craig actually wears Tom Ford Tobacco Vanille, Eau de Parfum. Now, there's no way that I don't sound like an idiot when I do that. So the reason I bring this up is because what we've seen with Casino Royale, and then more so post that with Daniel Craig, is a lot of influence on the actual actor's personal life, what he likes to wear outside of the character, everything from shoes, to pants, shirts, potentially even cologne. So if Daniel Craig actually wears something like Tom Ford Tobacco Vanille, it wouldn't be a far-fetched idea to see the future James Bond wear something that the future actor also wears. Tom Ford is a very highly respected designer brand. They make great scents. The scents are very expensive. This one in particular, the main notes in this, with the top notes being tobacco leaf, middle notes are vanilla, then the base notes are dried fruits along with some woody notes in there. So these kind of hint on some of the similarities to Floris with the woodiness, but then what makes it a little more masculine are those tobacco and spicy notes right at the top. Something like that, paired with the fact that Daniel Craig might wear this in his personal life, makes it very difficult not to see Bond wearing something like Tobacco Vanille. Once again, let's bring in Ryan. Ryan, help us out with this. Oil-based, alcohol-based, which is better?
There are a number of different methods for preserving scented materials and applying them to yourself. Most Western perfumery, most of the bottles you see here are alcohol-based perfumes. That is the standard method for preserving the aromatic materials that are used in perfume. The materials used in perfume are both what we call synthetic and natural, so they can be natural extracts, essentially essential oils, but they can also be synthetic, which usually means they are particular molecules taken from a natural source. For example, you might take a few molecules found in patchouli and isolate them and turn that into a material unto itself, and perfumers would use those. From the very start of 20th century perfumery, perfumery has always been a blend of synthetic and natural materials. So those are the materials that are generally hosted in the medium of alcohol. And alcohol has some wonderful aspects that suit those materials, because what it allows for those materials to do is kind of disperse nicely. When alcohol-based perfumes are splashed or sprayed, it has a nice diffuseness to it. So you get a really wonderful aromatic experience from start to finish that can accentuate some of the zestier notes too in fragrance. So you can get these very crisp openings. Not all molecules dissipate at the same rate, so you can get top notes, mid notes, base notes, depending on the stability of those molecules. So a lot of the top notes tend to be citrus. They tend to dissipate very quickly. And alcohol-based perfume allows for those notes to really sing in the air with a crisp pop as you first spray that. So you can get that kind of refreshing blast if you're spraying on something citrus-based. Now, oil-based perfumery is in many ways the more traditional style of perfumery. And when we talk about that, we're really talking about things like this, which is an attar. An attar is a traditional Eastern style of perfumery. It's popular in the Middle East, in India. And it preserves it in a kind of like, it's not in alcohol, so you don't spray it. You would apply this directly to skin. If I pull this out here, so you see this is oil that can be applied directly to skin. You wouldn't apply this to clothes, because as you can see, this is very dark, so it would stain this. You would apply this to skin, and it just kind of warms up naturally with your skin. So in many ways, the materials in this are very similar to the materials you would find in Western-based perfume. But the vehicle is different. You are not getting the spray of alcohol. You are getting a very dense, concentrated oil that goes on skin. And that allows materials to really sing out in their full-bodied richness. You're not getting as much of the zesty crispness you can get in alcohol-based perfumery, but you are getting a very dense, rich, rounded experience. This is a fragrance called Chic Alfaranzi by a house called Maison Anthony Marmin. I'm just going to plug it real quickly because it's really lovely stuff, and if you are interested in it, you're not going to find a better value for your dollar than this in the whole world of fragrance. It's a lovely, lovely attar that uses rare materials like oud and ambergris to create a gorgeous and unique effect. I get comments on this all the time, but it's not like anything else that you would see here. And so those are really the two different models of perfume. This is much more popular in the eastern side of the world, whereas the West has predominantly gone towards alcohol-based perfumes. And to that note, certain alcohol-based perfumes like the eau de colognes, like 4711, which is widely distributed throughout Europe and is served as the inspiration for modern perfumes like Tom Ford Neroli Portofino, is so heavy on the alcohol that in some ways they've been used as sanitation products. You can wash your hands in 4711 before dinner, for example, and you get like a nice scented quality. It's short-lived though, but there's so much alcohol in there that it almost has a sanitary effect to it. So people will tend to use it as a kind of low-grade hand sanitizer. So that's those are the two different sides of perfumery in terms of distribution medium.
So another thing that Bond would obviously have to consider when picking a cologne or perfume is the notes within the cologne, the different scents that you can pull when smelling a cologne or perfume. So the way the note pyramid would work, if you will, is you have top notes, middle or heart notes, and then base notes. So for something like tobacco vanille, your top notes right off the top would be tobacco leaf and spices. Then in the middle, you've got kind of your secondary notes, which would be vanilla, tonka bean, tobacco flower, and then your base notes would be wood, woodiness, woods, and then dry fruit accord, or dried fruits. So obviously, as you can tell, as I kind of fumble my way through this, I don't really know what I'm talking about. Ryan, help me out here, please. Teach me a little bit more about notes.
So when we talk about notes in perfume, it's very important that we acknowledge that we are not talking about ingredients. Ingredients in fragrance are different from notes. Notes are what you pick up. It's very similar to what you see in wine tasting videos and whiskey tasting videos where they're sampling it and they're picking up different notes. Like they might say they smell vanilla or apricot or things like that off the nose, even though there's no apricot or vanilla that's been added to the alcohol in question. That is the case with perfume. Perfume is built from raw materials, as noted before, synthetic and natural working together, but they are often combining to create an impression. It's much like paints being used to create a impression of a face. It's not really a face, but it's been created from different pigments that have pulled together to kind of create this illusion of light and shadow on a flat canvas. Similarly, in perfume, you can have a lot of small materials working to build a larger impression. So when a perfume says that it's when a perfume is named for tobacco or lists tobacco in the notes, it may not contain any tobacco absolute. Now, tobacco absolute is a raw material that perfumers have access to, but it's often the case that what's actually standing in for tobacco are materials that smell more like what people associate with tobacco. Because tobacco absolute, the raw stuff, does not really smell like a cigar or pipe tobacco. It actually has a very hay-like smell. So to create the aroma of tobacco in fragrances, perfumers will often lean on materials like tonka, which is used to cure tobacco, and will then be part of the finished product, so it has part of that aroma when you smell cured tobacco products in many cases. They'll also use other materials like patchouli and different things to bring out different facets in fragrance. You have your different categories of notes in perfume. You have your sort of woody notes, which would be your cedars and your sandalwoods. They're very different spectrums of woods. Sandalwood is a very calm, creamy, milky sort of wood, very calming, very big in classic perfumery. I actually think Trumper's sandalwood is one of the best ways to get to know sandalwood as a note. It's sandalwood with some citrus and vanilla, but the sandalwood is one of the best quality sandalwood notes you'll find in widespread, widely available perfumery. So Trumper sandalwood is excellent for that. Cedar is sharper. You can also have, oak and different woody tones like that. But it's generally common to see cedar or sandalwood utilized. You will have grassy notes like vetiver, Guerlain vetiver being a very significant reference point for the notes of vetiver. It's kind of a clean, fresh, vintage style vetiver, but it stands the test of time. But vetiver has that sort of grassy quality and tends to show up a lot. You have notes like patchouli that kind of move into that herbal hippie shop sort of space, depending on which kind of patchouli is being used. With all of these natural materials, they tend to have a range. They tend to have different species. You have floral notes like rose or jasmine, and then you have a lot of citrus notes. Bergamot is the biggest one that tends to be used in perfumery. Even when perfumes don't list it, it tends to be there because it's just helps accentuate the other notes, even when it's undetectable. But you can have citrus shifted into things like, mandarin orange or pineapple, which is a prominent factor in one of the most popular fragrances of the past, 15 years or so, which is Creed Aventus, which is a sort of smoky pineapple with birch. So you have this full range of notes, and together with other elements like vanilla and incenses and spices, can create all sorts of different effects. So you can have all of these together and it can still lean fresh, or you can still have all of this and it can lean very rich and dense and dark. One material that is worth probably discussing on its own because it's just so popular these days is oud, which is essentially a kind of fungus that grows on wood that's very rare, and is then extracted through a variety of methods, and how it smells can be different depending on the exact process that it's used to get into a perfume. It often has a woody, mysterious, medicinal smell, and has entered into Western perfumery in a largely like synthetic form, with different molecules kind of standing in for that sort of medicinal woodiness. Is very popular in perfumes today. I have two Floris perfumes out here that I love very much. They're leather oud and honey oud, which I think do a good job of incorporating the oud note into a still very traditional, crisp British presentation. So that's a good overview of notes. And, you can always look for more information. Fragrantica is a great resource. They have a page on pretty much any note you can name. And they'll be able to kind of like guide you into which perfumes might be certain reference points for you if you're to go to that site. So, very complex world. There are more notes. I'm discovering more notes every day, honestly, in this hobby. There's always something new to encounter, some perfume that's built around some note or idea that I haven't encountered. Just the other day, I purchased a perfume that was just built around the particularly wonderfully musty but comforting smell of old books and libraries. So you can find a lot of stuff out there in the fragrance and perfume world.
Dupes are great for many reasons. They are a substantially more affordable version of something like this. Now, this one I have here, this Tom Ford, is 30 milliliters. And this one, I think, is also 30, maybe 60 milliliters. Now, the price difference between the two is substantial. 30 milliliters of this, I believe, is close to $200, maybe more. This is like $40. Now, what they do is they would put the Tom Ford Tobacco Vanille through a chemical test, and it would extract basically the notes that you would eventually then put into a dupe perfume or cologne. So if you look on Alt's website, it shows what the notes are in this particular perfume. And it says the top notes are tobacco leaf and spices, which is exactly the same as Tom Ford. Middle is vanilla, tonka bean, tobacco flower, and then base is woods and dry fruit accord. So all three of the levels, top, middle, and base notes, are the same as Tom Ford. But the one thing that I know Ryan will touch on is you will never be able to extract everything when you do the chemical test. So there are some intangibles that will never make these two things smell exactly the same. But there is something to be said about making an alternative and more affordable version of one of these perfumes. Ryan, give us more information on this before I continue to misspeak.
So dupes, or clones, as they're also referred to in the fragrance community, brings up a complicated topic because it brings up thorny issues about authorship and imitation. And I have complex thoughts about that I have gone on about at length in other forums over the years. But I will say this fragrance industry is and has mostly flourished as part of the fashion industry. There are expressions of individual authorship, wonderful individual artisans working to create perfume, folks like the great Andy Tower of Tower Perfumes, Mark Sage of Clandestine Laboratories, these folks who are producing individual expressions of themselves. But in many cases, this is part of the fashion industry, or is fashion industry adjacent. And like anything in any industry, when somebody comes up with a great idea, everybody is inspired by it and seeks to imitate it. So you see a lot of copycatting between, Guerlain and Chanel and all these fragrance houses, that's how genres are established. The fougere, which I've talked about, became a genre because all of these houses were kind of pulling from each other's ideas. And you see the same thing happening with fashion. Somebody comes out with a particular suit cut that's very popular, and everybody starts to do their variation on it with different degrees. That's how perfume has largely worked. So it is the case that even something, this is not a cheap perfume, Merchant of Venice, arabesque, but it is, in the perspective of some folks, an imitation of Tom Ford Tobacco Vanille. Now, I would argue it's doing some things a little bit different. It's got some plum in here that Tobacco Vanille doesn't. The tobacco is a little bit more pungent and rubbery than what you get in Tobacco Vanille, so it has its own character. But if you were to smell this in the air, you could very easily mistake this for Tobacco Vanille. And this is not the only house that has done this. There are a number of very inspired by Tobacco Vanille fragrances that exist from very, notable houses. So if that's happening, it's also happening at lower tiers, where you are now seeing houses use a process that is essentially a sort of chemical analysis on scent. So when a major perfume comes out, you can do some basic scientific analysis on it to chemically analyze it and try to figure out which materials are producing those aromas. Now, it's not one-to-one. It's partially science, and then it's a bit of art, because you have to deduce which materials are being used, and often sometimes those materials are rare and you won't have access to that. So if you're one of these houses that is copying a perfume and trying to produce its own version of it, they're often having to substitute materials, and that requires them to do some canny craftsmanship on their part. In my experience, some dupes and clones are very good, and some are very disappointing, and it's one of those things where you just kind of have to know what you're looking for and be willing to take the risk that what you're going to get may be a little bit shallow. It's kind of like the equivalent of if you were to go buy an imitation Eames chair. Some of those are going to be made nicely, and you might end up buying a very cheap one if you're only seeing it online. There's the cases with certain dupes and clones that you're not seeing as much refinement. I would say there are a number of Middle Eastern houses in particular that can do some very nice versions of perfumes. They tend to put their own spin on it in the process. Houses like Al Haramain, Rasasi, those houses also offer their own unique perfumes, but they tend to riff on Western styles. So those often have a little bit more reliable character in my personal experience. Thank you for having me, Luke. I'm always happy to talk about fragrance, and talking about fragrance and James Bond together is something of a dream come true, so I've had a great time.
So now that Ryan and I have overloaded with tons and tons of information, and I can't thank Ryan enough for helping me out with this, my personal opinion is I would expect James Bond, the character, regardless of who plays him or who's writing him, to wear something like Floris. I think the heritage with Bond itself, with Fleming, with the novels, makes it a no-brainer. Leave comments below. Let me know if you agree, disagree. If you do agree with Floris, which scent? 71, 72, 007, obviously probably different name if it's in the film. Number 89, like Fleming. What would you choose? Leave your comments below. Thank you again, Ryan, for helping me out with this. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.